Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first webinar of Effective Communications in the Workplace, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward and I'll be your MC for this webinar and for the duration of the course. Your mentor is Brenton Birchmore. We will focus on effective communication as it pertains to digital mediums with this course because it's necessary in any case these days, but also it sort of seems particularly relevant with the current COVID-19 crisis. Wherever you're watching this, we hope you are safe and well. Before we begin, the usual housekeeping. All webinars for this course will be held at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, with recordings made for those of you who cannot attend on a given occasion. Despite the recordings, if you can make it, we really hope you'll attend the live webinars and contribute to a collaborative learning environment. We quite clearly use Zoom for our webinars and encourage questions and the use of chat throughout the course. We ask that you direct all course content questions to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions, dates, times, resource availability, things like that, to Hannah in the support chat. You can chat with panelists only or to your fellow students as well, and you can make that choice by toggling through the drop-down box once you've opened the chat log. There's usually some really experienced attendees who are pretty helpful with any questions you might have. Their insights often augment the content that we deliver, so I recommend keeping everyone in the loop. We'll have Q&A sessions throughout the webinars. Generally at the end, there'll be a nice big one, and if a question's particularly relevant, I'll interject during Brenton's discussion or if we get to a natural point in the slide deck. For those of you who have never taken part in a short course with us, first of all, welcome. IT Masters is a training organisation that exists as a partner to CSU solely, who we work with to create and deliver a number of their Masters courses. We also market these courses on CSU's behalf and hope that the best way to do that is to give some of it away free in these short courses. If we do a good enough job, then students will be encouraged to enrol in the full Masters if it suits them, if they've enjoyed the content. With that said, I really want this course to be useful and a rewarding exercise in its own right. We want you to learn some interesting information, have a bit of fun hopefully, make some connections with some of your fellow students. To date there's about 2,500 enrolled in this short course, so you're spoiled for choice to who to chat with. Hannah is around as usual in an administrative and technical support role for IT Masters. She's responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, and we'll chuck that in the chat now. That's the Moodle page or the course page, and that's where you find all of the materials needed for this course. Links to readings, discussion forums and quizzes, and Brenton always does a power of work and does some extra audio recordings for which I'm really grateful. If you have any questions now or later on, please feel free to contact us using the details on that page and we'll try and sort you out. Next week, I'll talk a bit about CSU and try and give you an idea of what studying with us is all about and how these short courses can help you in completing a postgraduate course. So if you have any questions about paid study, just hold them over and we'll answer them next week. It's time to welcome Brenton, who I'm sure many of you will know. I'm pretty excited to have him running another short course with us. It's been a while. He's done a couple of single webinars, but not a short course for quite some time. He's a good friend of ours. He's been around forever. He's been teaching and designing courses for us for 10 years for IT Masters and Charles Sturt Uni. He's authored and delivered heaps of subjects. Last count I think was 13, covering many of our courses, not just the management and communication side of things, but also some of the project management courses as well. He is a graduate. He's a Master of ICT in Education and has an MBA. Has won the Top Mentor Award based on student feedback several times. Has taught more than 75,000 students with these short courses and with his actual subjects in the Masters courses, which is pretty amazing. And as I'm sure many of you will remember, has designed a learning app. We tested it in a beta form like a few short courses of his ago. I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about that later in the course and maybe even get to use it. I'm not sure. We'll see how we go. Hello, Brenton. How are you doing?
Hello, Guy. Thanks very much for the intro. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in. We are back for another exciting webinar. We are going to be tackling a whole bunch of things out of the MGI 521 professional communications subject, which has just had a revamp. It's just been updated and brought up to speed with the modern world, the modern situation. We've got a lot more digital content in it. So we wanted to use this short course as a way of introducing some of that content back out to you on the for free through this. So that's where we're going to be going. We are going to start today with some fundamentals because we need that underpinning to help put more of the digital conversation on top of that. Now, Guy, would you mind putting the poll up there? I just wanted to kick off with a question. This is a question about, do you consider great communications, great professional communications to be a trait? Do you think it's a skill, or do you think it's a talent? Is it a trait that really, you've got it or you don't? Or is it a skill that really anyone can do really well? Or is it really a talent where some people can do really well, but other people have a pretty low cap to what they can get to? Now, I'm broadcasting from sunny Singapore, right on the equator, and it's storm o'clock here at the moment, so you might even hear a few peals of thunder later, because I just heard some then. And we only have two seasons here in Singapore. There's the hot and wet season, followed by the wet and hot season. So yeah, pretty regular thunderstorms. Now, we're going to have a few things happening over the next few weeks. We will talk about the app in a little later, but there's going to be a few things like a quiz. There'll be a few things like an activity that's optional. And I just want to, can we close the poll? Because I think everyone's had a go at that. Has anyone last minute jump? No, people are still jumping in. Let's let them finish.
Yeah, we've got about 70% now.
Right, okay. Yeah, the participated number is jumping up a lot.
Yeah, okay, great. But we've got a huge majority for mostly a skill. Anyone can become good at it, or at least much better by learning and practicing.
Right.
So the rest are sort of single digits, a little of each. I'm going to sit on the fence here. Mostly a talent. They've both got about 10%, and then the rest are almost nothing. So
the encouraging thing out of that, of course, is that being here, being part of this, is trying to unlock the door. And one of the things that we're going to go through is some of the fundamental psychology behind what makes us tick when we communicate and why certain things happen. Because to put the practical things on top of it, it's really useful to know why we do what we do. I'll give you an example. Filler words, the ums and ahs. So the question is, why do we use those? But not just, well, why in practical terms do we use it, but what happens psychologically in our mind when we use a filler? And it comes down to stress. So when we have a pause, when we're communicating with someone, we're speaking to them, and we hesitate, we pause. Maybe we're trying to think of the words, maybe we're deciding what to say next. We're often concerned that that person might jump in and hijack the conversation. They might take the topic somewhere else. They might be waiting for that opportunity from us. And often we're concerned about that. We're also concerned about not having momentum in our delivery. So when we can't think of what to say next, and it's momentary fractions of a second, we feel a sense of stress. We want to continue the momentum of the outpour of words and sounds. So we fill it with an innocuous sound. We fill it with an or an ah. But what we're doing is our language center, which is needing to control what we speak and think of what we want to say next, as in the words we're going to use. That really struggles to do both of those jobs at the same time. So we need the pauses. But the thing is, the people that are listening to us, they usually need the pause just as much as we do, for two reasons. One of which is the one we're concerned about. Like when they are waiting for an opportunity to jump in and say something, there's a burning thought, and we've been there ourselves. We've had that burning thought in our mind and think, well, we really want to say something. We're waiting for that opportunity. In that moment, how much of what we're saying to them do you think is really sinking in? And how much of it are they going to remember 10 seconds later? Because their mind is consumed with what they want to say. So maybe we should actually pause, let it out. Let them say what they're going to say. Let it happen, and then take the conversation back into our flow. We might get a better result. Or maybe they've just got a lot of thinking to do. If we're having trouble thinking of what to say next, they might be having trouble thinking of what we meant. So the psychology of the stress response, if we convert that to say, actually, a pause is not a cause for stress. It is a useful tool. It is something that we can leverage to improve the outcome of our communication. It becomes something in our kit bag. It's something that we can take advantage of. We're no longer stressed about it. It's not something that bothers us anymore. And so the ums and ahs disappear, and we stop saying them, we stop using them, or at least we stop the need to. So what that is an example of what we're going to go through to some extent, at least this week and a little bit over the next few weeks. So let's get into it. I'm going to close the poll. We'll close that. Did I do that right, Guy? Gone.
Yep, should be gone now.
So when we talk about professional communications, we've used a particular phrase here, professional communications. And what we mean by that is communications that has a purpose. It's not about expression. And I specifically want to separate expression from communications. And we'll delve into more structurally how that looks. But we're talking about communications that has a job to do that is outside of what we want to express. It's not just us getting something out there. And usually that is a result that we're aiming for that is separate from us and separate from the recipient, because there's a higher purpose. There's usually an organization, a company or a team or a group. There's something that's bigger than both of us. And usually that is one of the main beneficiaries of whatever it is we're communicating about. Now, if we think about psychology, it's rich with complexity, but the laws and rules regarding how we communicate, they're also somewhat complex, but they're actually also quite predictable. They're quite understandable. There's something that we can actually apply. And how much difference does it make? Well, I'll hold that question because I would like you all to ask that question of yourselves, perhaps in another few weeks, once you've been through a lot of the things that we're going to cover, because my point of view isn't going to necessarily matter very much. But obviously, I'm going to be thinking it's probably going to make a huge difference. To some people, in some situations, a significant jump in their communications can make a life-changing difference to their ability to achieve, succeed, and be satisfied in the professional environment. So if it's really useful and it's understandable, how hard is it? Well, it's no harder than what you're going to cover over the next 4 weeks. You'll have a few hours of things that you can listen to. By the end of that, you will have a significant list of things that you can pick and choose from. You won't adopt all of it. You won't need all of it. There'll be bits and pieces there, many perhaps that you'll think, well, yeah, I knew that already. Maybe there'll be some things that you thought, well, I kind of knew that, but I kind of don't apply that all the time. And maybe now I will apply it more because I can see why it works. So hopefully we will be able to add to your kit bag, to your communications toolkit that will help you find ways that you can improve your bits of communication, because it's unique for everybody. We've all been communicating our whole lives. And how we do that is a lot to do with habit. It's a lot to do with what we've become used to. And a lot of us have so much potential to improve our communications simply by making the decision that that's something of value. And by just analyzing the way in which we communicate, by simply looking at it as a thing that we can do better, that's our starting point to say, well, how much can we take on? Now, I want to talk about how far this can go. There was a research study done that looked at neural coupling. And what they did is they got people inside the MRI machine looking at their brain patterns when they were communicating. And amongst all the testing that they did, they found that when people were truly aligned in their understanding and they could truly understand the communications, the exact same areas of the brain, areas of the language center of the brain lit up. The same portions. And when that happened, the listener was actually able to predict what the speaker would say next. Now, these weren't people that knew each other. They were just listening to a message. And when that message was well crafted and they understood it, they could predict. They understood it that well. It was almost like telepathy. Wouldn't it be great if that happened all the time in the workplace? Well, I'm not going to suggest that it can, but that's how far we can go with just the mechanics of communicating. just the simple tools that we have available, language and the medium. And that's all we need. It can get that deep and that rich. So when we need to communicate professionally, we need to transfer understanding. We need to be able to help somebody else understand something as thoroughly and as effectively as we understand it. We need to transfer not just information, not just data, not just knowledge even. We need to help them understand the background. We need to help them understand the why. Because whatever we've imparted, it won't be enough. There'll be some piece of knowledge that's missing that they will need to use or apply or bring to the outcome. And they'll need to know enough about what we're trying to achieve to understand how to use their own knowledge or other knowledge that they get from somewhere else. So in a professional environment with professional outcomes, understanding is our goal. And we can't really afford to aim for any less than that. So aligned understanding is when two people understand the same thing in the same way, as in subject to the same forces, the same cause and effect. So how we define that, how we put a box around that, is we define it from the perspective of decision making. So when we communicate and we try to get an aligned understanding, which is the goal of professional communications, what we're aiming for as our test is how well that will influence decision making. The recipient's decision making, person that we're communicating with, the people that we're communicating with, they're going to make decisions. How they make them and how well that leads towards the outcome that we're looking for, that's the real test. Now that's a high benchmark to reach. So we're going to break it down into 3 layers of understanding. This is partly an educational paradigm. This is a fundamental of the way the mind learns and understands things. So there's the conceptual understanding. Concepts are the laws of cause and effect that our entire world is governed by. That's the real fundamentals. Some of what we're talking about tonight are concepts. Then there's contextual understanding. So in the context, it's how do those rules relate to something? How do they apply in a specific situation? What is that specific situation? So that's what gives those rules meaning. So a concept would be online education. That would be a concept. Or perhaps even a webinar would be a concept. The context is a webinar about communications in the workplace, digital communications in the workplace. That would be the context. And the content would be all of the slides and all of the specifics and all of the details that I'm presenting to you. Or in the case of some other professional communication, the details will be the pieces of knowledge that a person uses to make a specific decision or a set of decisions. So we need to get the level of understanding in another person through these layers. Now, if you ask yourself the question, where does most communication start? Where do we kick off? Well, usually we kick off from here. And this part above it is often assumed or overlooked or not even considered. We're going to go through some practicalities of that. Let's look at the psychology of what happens in a recipient's mind. So what goes on in their head. So we're communicating professionally. They've received a message. It could be something that they're listening to. It could be an email that they've read. There's a process that they go through. The first thing they do is they want to interpret, what did we mean? That's their first step. That's their first challenge. They want to know, what did I mean? So the next thing they want to do is, if they think they've understood that, they will want to decide, what does it mean to them? They will want to know, well, Brenton says this. Okay, I think I know what he means. What do I feel about that? What does that matter to me? And the third part of that process, before they've yet to make a decision, or really this is where they might make it, is how are they going to allow that to influence what they do? Now, these colors have a meaning. We're going to come to that in a moment. So keep an eye on those colors. But this is what goes on in the mind of a recipient in professional communications every time. Now, some of it will be lightning fast. It'll be over in a fraction of a second. Some of it will be more drawn out. The faster and the more accurately we can get that recipient through these steps, and the more accurately they can make an aligned decision about these 3 points that we want them to, the more likely and the quicker that they will get to this point and make the decision that we want them to make for the outcome that we need, because that's what our professional communications is all about. Now, George Bernard Shaw, great quote from him. The biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So if we think about all those times when we've seen communications take place in the workplace and it didn't happen the way, it didn't result in the way we wanted it to. And it might have been from us or to us, and it just didn't work. And in some organizations, a lot of communication can suffer that. In its simplest definition, it's some breakdown in one of these 3 steps. Or it could be that it didn't get all the way through this. But this is the formula. And what we want to do is try and think of ways that will help us get through each of these 3 steps. So the 3-con model, which is what we talked about with the concept, context, and content. A concept has to be established first. If a person doesn't have the same conceptual understanding of something, they're not going to be able to understand the message or what the communication is about. Now, for all of us in a professional environment, we can assume a colleague that we work with regularly, they may have enough conceptual understanding, but someone outside of that bubble, they might not. We might need to check our assumptions about exactly what they understand to be the conceptual rules at work here and how it works. And if we think back and think of perhaps moments where there was a real conceptual disconnect, a lack of knowledge on the other person, it's common for us to say, well, they should have known. They should have known better. And maybe we're right, and maybe they should have. But did that help us get our result? Did that assumption, did that expectation of us on that other professional and their failure to deliver on that, how did that affect our ability to achieve and succeed? Could we have done something a little differently? An even more likely issue arises with context. This is one of the most commonly overlooked elements of the communications framework. Have you ever had those moments where you walk into a room or someone walks up to you and they just start talking as if they just picked up a conversation that they were halfway through in their head, and you've just entered that conversation, and maybe they were simulating in their head what they were saying to you, and they just picked up halfway through that and they're talking at you, and you're like, what's this about?
If
right?
You haven't, does that mean that it's probably me?
If you've never felt like that, if you've never had that moment, then maybe you do have telepathy. But it's something that all of us do at some point, usually when we're excited, usually when we don't have that cognitive filter. And we're going to go through how those filters work in a moment. But this is the absence of context. This is where we had to wind back a step. Oh, we're talking about this, right? My wife and I do this all the time. The content, that's usually where we start. And it's usually actually should be the last thing. We've got to get these first 2 correct and clear before we go ahead and give the detail. Doesn't matter whether we're talking to someone, whether we're sending an email, whether we're chatting on instant messaging, start with the context. Yes, you can probably assume concept. Make sure you can. Start with the context. Hi, Fred, about the so-and-so. Fred's immediately got his head into that space, right? Brenton's texting me about this. The next message, he will understand to a significantly higher, the next thing I say, significantly higher percentage of understanding for him. Because he's just aligned his brain mentally into that context. If I don't do that, then he's got to interpret. He's got to think, what's Brenton mean here? I've said 2, 3 things, 4 texts, 5 texts, maybe 4 or 5 lines in my email. Then he figured, oh, it's about that thing. Right. Okay. So he just spent those first few moments with his brain processing, trying to get into context. Whatever content I've delivered at that point, a lot of it may have been lost. So when a few moments later in the conversation, I say, hang on, no, I just told you that. He's like, well, no, I didn't. Oh, I was talking about that thing when his brain wasn't able to receive it. My fault or his? So when we're dealing with verbal communications, it's easy to adjust how we say something. Actually, let's me pause for a second. Before we're going to talk a little bit about language, I want to ask, Guy, we got any good questions yet that we can tackle?
Yeah, we got
and
a
I want to
couple.
remind everyone, if you have questions, if you think, oh, but yeah, but what about this? Or what about that? Put them up in the questions box and we'll pause for a moment and grab them.
Okay, great. An anonymous attendee who sounds a bit like me, how to decide when to speak in excitement and when to speak in a serious tone, how to identify the situation, the context.
So my advice there is to say that which of those two has the greatest risk associated with it and which therefore should be your default. So there's two parts of the question. How do you decide? You decide by reading the other person. Now that's only if you have access to something that lets you read the other person or your audience. If you can read them, then that'll fill in the blanks for you. If you can't read them, you need some feedback. So you need to start with something that is not necessarily important to your goal. You start with something that's innocuous. You start with something that's simply an opening to gauge their current situation, their current mood, their current responsiveness. Are they receptible? Are they in a down mood where me speaking with excitement is going to clash and want them wanting to block out my energy? Or are they very excitable and where if I come in serious, it will lower their tone and lower their mood and therefore lower their receptibility? So you want to match as much as you can, or you want to pull them a little bit in the direction that you want to go. If you want to be serious or you want to be excitable, you got to pull them gently in that direction, but don't make it too jarring. Put in something a little bit that'll help you get a bit of a feel for it. And if you just can't get any feedback, decide which one is going to have the biggest risk and go with that go with the safe option as a default until you get some feedback.
So is that as simple as, how are you going?
Yes, but you might say how you go. If it's in person, you'd say how you're going with a smile. Then that message says you're not just asking as a throwaway line. You're asking because you're interested to know the answer. So there's that extra element to it. If you're doing it in chat, one of the things you might open a chat with is, how are you today? Now, some people will react with, well, what's he want? He's just being nice, right? What's he
What
want?
does that mean?
What exactly? So different people will respond in a different way. And if they're really, really busy, you'll get to know a bit of a habit. If you are a certain person with a habit, especially with things like instant messaging, be aware of your own habits. Be aware of the expectations that you set amongst others. And try to be consistent with that, because that will improve and speed up the process of getting to know where people are at in that moment.
Cool, thanks. A few questions flooded in. Ibangura has asked, how do you remove barriers, read the 3 cons to your target audience? And I think that might be something we'll talk about in future weeks, targeting it to a particular audience.
Yes, we will. Some of it we'll cover in a moment. Some of the specifics, but general specifics. And when it comes to particular audiences, yes, we will cover that in subsequent weeks, because that's getting more granular than we have covered tonight.
All right, beauty. So
I'll ask to hold on to
hold that question for a few weeks. Can you give an example of concept, context, and content? Maybe are there sort of, you can work through from one to the next or the other?
Yeah. So that question might have come in before I gave the example of webinar, communications webinar, and these slides. So a concept would be going to a conference. Conferences are a thing. We go to a conference, we know how that works. We turn up, we have a 3-day thing. We have bites of food in between, we mix and mingle, and that's a conceptual thing that we understand. The context would be the subject matter that it's all about. And the content would be the slides that we walk away with, the business cards we walk away with, the actual people that we've met. That's the content, that's the details of it. So you don't necessarily need to explain to someone what's the concept of a conference if you're all there at a conference and we all know how conferences work. But if you're talking to a customer about how your services operate and how your services and how maybe cloud services work differently from on-premises services conceptually, maybe that's not an assumption you can make.
Cool. We've got heaps of questions now, but
All
maybe
right,
we'll
I
just
won't be able to
finish
get all
with
through all of them.
we'll just go with one now.
Okay.
One that I think is a bit of fun. Wendy has asked, are emojis considered professional?
Whoa, have you been reading ahead of my slides? Okay, I'm going to jump ahead and answer and say yes and no, but now I'm going to be cryptic and say, well, I'm going to explain that at a contextually appropriate point in the discussion tonight.
Great.
So that'll be in about 20 minutes, 20 something, 15, 20 minutes.
Alrighty, let's keep going.
All right.
We'll have a big Q&A at the end.
Okay, I want to talk about language, because if we're speaking to someone verbally, we have tone of voice. We have the way in which our inflection, with the vocabulary, but not just the vocabulary, but how we say something. And in person, if you can see them, body language. So if we have that, and we've had that for millennia as human beings, we need that layer of our communications. We crave it, right? This is going to go back to that emoji question. In a moment, you're going to see where I'm linking these two up. We crave that layer of knowing the tone, the intent, the character, the mindset, the attitude of the person that we're receiving from. Humans really need that. And we know that humor and sarcasm lands very differently. A literal communication is not a natural human communication. So if we just have the written word and that's all we've got, we are still looking for things in that says, what does this person feel when they wrote this? And this is where tone matters. And this is where you get the very specific thing that professional writing, one of its hallmarks is that it's trying to take away some of the unnecessary and unhelpful tone. So the use of professional language, if you want to say, well, what does that really mean? It means neutralizing the tone so you don't get unintended, unpredictable, and inappropriate emotional responses, because the reader is assuming the author's emotions inaccurately. So we choose our words in professional communications because we're choosing words that are less likely to be reacted to in a different way. Because every little emotional response, remember those three things we talked about? What does it mean to them? That's going to be influenced by what tone they perceive. And we know this in tone of voice. If you equate that to tone of voice, you know when someone is speaking serious tone versus passionate and excited tone, as per the question raised before. We know there's a huge difference in how that's going to be responded to emotionally. The exact same things happen when we write something. So we can't say, well, it's just written, they're not going to react to it, it's just words. Well, no, they will. And this is because of the concept of a dialogue. Even when we are reading something, like an email, and I'm talking about something that's been authored, where someone's actually authored and written this. If it's just a publication where it's from the company generally, we won't. But if it's from a person, then each word, each point, each sentence that we read, we will process it as if it's a conversation. Part of our brain will be judging each point, each sentence, each thing, and we will be thinking in our minds of what we would have said had this been a dialogue. We are still working that way because we've worked that way for thousands of years. And so when we read something, it's getting judged point by point, sentence by sentence. This is one of the reasons why the language needs to work this way. And it means that when we're writing it, we need to know this. We need to think about this. We need to understand what we're building. What kind of change are we building and creating in the reader? What's their reaction? What's their response? And then what's their reply? So when we're writing an email, it's like these three stages. They're going to react to it first. Based on that, they're going to respond, and then maybe they'll reply and let us know what their response is. So the reply is kind of that last little bit after. It's part of the motivational vector. Let's go through the fundamental principle. I mentioned before there was different colors, and those colors are describing a concept known as the vectors of change. The vectors of change are the three different ways or directions of change that occur during a communication. There's the intellectual change, the change in what we know. That's just knowledge. That's just we gain something that we understand. The second is the emotional change, the change in our emotional state as a result of what we've just learned. And the third is a change in what we're going to do as a result, a change in our decision-making. This relates back to what we said before. What do I think that person really means? That's the intellectual vector. What does that mean to me? That's my emotional vector. And what am I going to do about it? That's my motivational vector. So we're going to use this. I'm going to come back to this in a number of different ways, in a number of different places. But if you ask me now, hang on, what is it that is creating these changes? You know, they're vectors, they're directions of change, but what does that? There's the concept very strongly in professional communications called the message. And it's a thing. It really is a thing. It's a tool. It's something that we apply as a tool, and we should think of it as a tool. And I make that distinction because we have to not think of our communications as an expression. That's social. Okay. And we communicate socially in the workplace, but if we need an outcome, that's possibly not enough. We use a message, and a message has a beginning and an end. It has a starting point, which is its contextual origins. A message is about something. And it ends on an expectation and a clarity of where it should lead to an action. So it ends on the motivation. So you have this thing as a tool that goes through this process, and its process is all based on why does it exist? What's the message for? Because professional communications, right? It has an outcome. Every message has a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, it's just expression. It's going to be handled very differently. So if it's a message and it's got to do something, we need to be thinking about the rules of human interaction that it needs to follow in order for it to do that thing. And we want it to be true to ourselves and its purpose. Obviously, it's going to have to be true to its purpose or it won't succeed. But it needs to be true to ourselves so that we can tap into all of the assumptions and predictions that our audience is going to make about us, about how we normally communicate. What do we really mean? There'll be habits that they will be able to leverage that will allow them to more quickly understand what we mean. So when we send messages in professional communications, it entirely remains the responsibility of the communicator. This is a tough one to sometimes accept. Every failure of communications ultimately becomes the responsibility of the communicator, not the communicatee. If the other person doesn't get it, doesn't act upon it, if it's the communications that has failed, that's on us. Because we're the ones that want the outcome. It can't be anyone else's responsibility, and it can't be anyone else's job to improve it or fix it, because we're the ones that want the result. And if we want the result, we've got to do the things necessary for the communications to function as a tool in order to get the result, just like any other tool. We've all heard the phrase, a good workman doesn't blame their tools. These are just tools. We are the workmen. We need to use them appropriately. So in professional communications, fundamental difference, not an expression of thought, it's a tool. We craft them every time for a purpose. And yes, we craft the message. A message might be a series of statements, an email, it might be a few things we say, but every message is something we craft. Here's something that helps take this to the next level. This is the STAR model, which was published by John Adair. So it's in his book, Effective Communications. It's an older book now. It's been around for a while, but it's got some very good points in it. This is one of them. Now, the STAR model shows a number of things, and I'm going to talk to you about them in order. What order we normally will go to. This is where the human mind normally tends to go, where we start with us. Now, most 5-year-olds don't go much beyond that. Sometimes we don't go much, but you have that moment where we're trying to, we've got this idea and we're struggling to find the right words. We can't put it together, and it's like, it feels like we're babbling a little bit. That's because that's as far as we've got through the process. But if we think of what we're going to say and how we're going to say it, then that's our content. All right, so we've got the words. We figured out the words. All right, now, older kids will do this. They will make the effort to think about what to say. We all typically as adults do this. The professionals in the workplace will typically do this. We'll choose our words. But the third point is about the purpose. And this is where human habit and the intent to be a little bit quick, lazy, efficient with our communications means that we often don't stop to think, do we have the right words for this purpose? Are we doing, is what we're communicating leading us towards the outcome we want? This is an important piece in professional communications. Now, I have a 12-year-old son, and he's kind of at this level. He's able to do this. He's learning how to do this. And he's just starting to learn this next bit, which is where you shape your communications based on who is listening, which means he's at the stage now where if he wants something, he'll ask mum quite differently to the way he will ask dad. And we all sort of had that period in our life when we learned and figured out we get different answers if we ask a different way of a different person. Well, in the professional communications environment, this is equally essential, because just like when we were 12 and we wanted something, in the professional environment, every single message is because we want something. Now, there's two more steps. The methods. What's the right method? Well, if you're in instant messaging and you're 10, 20, 30 messages deep into a conversation, maybe we should be picking up the phone. Maybe we should be calling. Maybe we should be push the other button that says talk. If we are that deep in something technical, maybe we should have put it in an email. Or maybe if it is in an email and we're trying to write paragraph after paragraph, second guessing what they're going to be asking, maybe that should have been a conversation. Choose the medium, choose the method of communications that suits the outcome. And lastly, the situation, which is everything else outside of the people involved, everything that's influencing them. And I'll give you an example now in the current work from home, stay at home environment that many of us are in. Time of day has become a situation that has become contentious. Many of us have had that thing where somebody else is solving problems at a time of day that doesn't suit us to help them. Communications are so easy and interruptible now. There's not the same restrictions on what's a work day. And so some of those barriers have been eroded. But the STAR model says this is all the things that we should be thinking about. And some of them we won't make the effort because it's not worth the investment. We're not going to go that deep into something because it has a very small return on investment for us. But some things will really matter. And some things we will need to think all the way through based on what the objective is that we need. Got a couple of points to talk about still. Have we got any good questions, Guy, on what we've covered?
We've got an enormous number of questions. Nothing particularly about the STAR method.
No, that's okay. But is there any there that you want to pick out now, or should we take them there? Because we've got 15 minutes or so.
No, let's hold them over. I'm sure we'll have a fairly long Q&A session at the end. Yep. One question about the STAR method, though, is sort of whether the different points all pointing at the aim is anything specific, is it?
Everything serves the aim. Yes. So this is the order that we generally will tackle them. So this is how deep we go in our investment. But you're right, everything serves this purpose. So which method we choose is based on this. How we consider the sender will depend upon what the goal is. And we touched a little bit on that, the question that came, how do you decide when to be serious or energetic? Well, the sender might have an influence on that. And whether or not you want them to be tugged towards serious or energetic is probably going to be determined by this. So each individual tactic, each individual decision, each individual design component that goes into your message crafting, all of this serves this purpose. Mm. So yeah, thanks for making that point, because that's the central theme. So part of what we often try to do, the deeper thing in professional communications, is that we want to convince someone of something. We want to influence them. We want to persuade. And sometimes when we start with content, we start with the details, when we're rushing in with our energy, we're often inclined to say, I've got a solution, I've got an answer, I've got a thing, and let me convince you. Let me tell you all about it. Let me bombard you with my logic and my passion and try to convince you that this is great. Well, often we will encounter pushback even before any of the knowledge about our thing has been revealed. And that is the pushback against the method. So the most disarming way to go about beginning persuasion and influence is to start with questions. And that's really hard to do for us, for most people. It's unnatural because it has to put a check on our passion. But if we do that, what we can do is we can ask questions that gather some information about that person, understand what their current position is, their current perspective, their current situation. Ask them about the intellectual components. What's the situation? Whatever it is that we want to influence them about, ask them about the details. Make sure our understanding of it is aligned with theirs. Then we might ask them about the emotional side of it. Ask them, how bad is that? How good is that? How much is that? How little is that? Help them talk about what it means to them. Bring that to the surface in their minds. If we're trying to get influence or persuasion because we're trying to fix something, then without that pain, there won't be any change. There won't be a decision in our favor. We won't get influence unless there's a reason for it. And the reason is usually solve a pain, grab an opportunity. So that comes from the emotional vector. And so in persuasion, we want the other person to feel either a desire for something or a wish to not have something. That's the implied need. So by reminding them of all the things that they've actually forgotten, especially if it's negative, because that's our defense mechanism, right? We don't want to be reminded of how painful things are every day. So we block that part out of our brain. We stop thinking about it. If we want to influence someone, we might need to remind them of that. So then we can ask more questions about, well, what if we had this? What if this was true? What if this was the case? And as we still asking questions, we haven't told them anything. We're still asking questions, guiding them through the three vectors of change to say, well, at that point, at the motivational stage, we're trying to ask them to help describe the result, the purpose, the intent, the reason we want this influence in the first place, which means we have to know it very clearly. So that when they are answering the kinds of questions because we've led them to that point, they are taking a sense of ownership. So then they're starting to be a participant in the creation of the influence. Then they're sold on it because they're selling themselves. So using this in influence, we start with the logical, the reasoning. We want to ask questions about how they feel about it. And with that feeling, they have a sense of ownership. They might not own the idea, they might not own the knowledge, but everyone owns their feelings. That is an inseparable human phenomenon. We own our feelings. So when we feel something, we are inevitably invested. What we want to then do is trigger the investment in a particular direction. That's our influence. That's our outcome. And we can do all of that by telling them nothing and asking them everything. John Hancock was one of the signatories on the US Declaration of Independence. In fact, I think it was the first signature. And 18th century successful businessman once quoted as saying, greatest ability in business is to get along with others, influence their actions. Influence their actions. So how does that relate then? How do some of these things relate to digital media, social media, communications? Let's lift it up a notch, okay? All these rules that we've talked about, all these interactions, these psychological elements, how much of that survives and gets lost in translation in digital media and digital communications? Well, as most of us have probably experienced at some point or other, a lot of it can be lost in the reductions that take place in digital media. And next week, we're going to go deep into specific digital media, and we're going to talk about how to avoid this, how to work with it, and how to specifically lift your results and outcomes because of this fact. So much of it gets lost in translation. Back to that question that was asked before. Excellent prophetic question. Emojis, are they unprofessional? Now, you've got a conflicting answer here, because two things that I've said to you already tonight. I've said that business language, if it's just the written word, the language we use is our tone of voice. It's equivalent to the tone of voice. So we might be thinking, hang on, emojis, you know, they're risky. They sound a bit cavalier. They sound a bit unprofessional. But the human mind is craving that extra layer of understanding. And if we don't give them some way of getting it, they'll make an assumption about it, because they're not going to be able to understand that second important question. What does it mean to them? They're not going to be really wanting to answer that and be satisfied with the answer and happy with their answer unless they have a bit of an idea as to how we were projecting what we gave them. This is human nature. We really want that. Emojis were invented specifically to meet that human need in a digital format, in the most abbreviated fashion. So if you ask this question, sometimes you'll get a different answer generationally. Right? You ask someone like me as a Gen X, you might get a different answer to, you know, what you get from my 12-year-old son as a millennial. So you're going to find that an increase in acceptability in some sections of the population because they've figured out what's comfortable for them in being able to use that as a tool to enhance what they can get out of the communications. So if we accept that that's a necessary thing, then we have to accept that, yeah, it does a job. Now, we might still say unprofessional, can't use it, but it doesn't mean that it's not useful in some interactions, in some messages. Now, if you're writing a letter to your customers where you need to have unambiguous and literal translation, you wouldn't use emojis. But if you're communicating with a peer and you need that peer to do something or to act in a certain way, and you want to be persuasive, and you need to convey and make clear that you have a certain position, you might use them. They might be very appropriate in that situation. I use them in emails, but I use them very rarely and only generally with people that I'm familiar with. How many of these rules still apply in digital mediums? All of it. The example I just gave you is underpinning that. The need for that emotional understanding exists, whether we want it to or not. And if we can't find a way to meet that, it can undermine the outcomes. So all the rules still apply. We just got to be more clever about how we use them in a digital format. And a reminder, what is the syntax we use, the words we choose, the language we choose, and how that is perceived? That's our tone. And it's vitally important that we have some of that in our messaging. And what's the most important thing to consider? Anyone want to put something in the chat? What's the most important thing? Single word.
Yeah, we've got context.
Context. The most
Receiver,
important thing to
received,
consider.
aim, audience.
Audience. Some
Outcome.
of you are talking about different, the same thing for different chickens. Yes. Purpose.
Manners.
Now, here's a quick point on that, right? Because I didn't give you enough contextual framework about my question, some of you were thinking context. Some of you with, I said a few things were important tonight, right? Which one did I really mean here? I didn't tell you what I was considering it for. If I'd said to you, which is the most important thing to consider when designing your message, more of you might have thought, yeah, he means purpose. Perfect example of how a slight little lack of contextual question component and your answer is different. Except the chickens. That one's dead on. Right, last slide. 3 quick points, then we'll dive into some of these questions. We need to be concise. This is going to sound contradictory. We need to be concise so that we're not creating unnecessary things for people to think about, because the more unnecessary thoughts they have, the harder it is for us to control. The more work we've got to do, it's hard enough to get the core of our message across in a digital format, let alone deal with all of the other fluff that might come out of saying too much. But we need to be clear. We don't want them to be doing mental gymnastics on our behalf to try and understand us. We need to be true to ourselves because we want to leverage every bit of accurate predictability that they might have about how we communicate is an advantage for us. It should be part of our toolkit. We have to maintain it and we have to look after it. And we have to consider the other person as well. Because as every 12-year-old knows, if you want something from dad, it's going to be different than if you want something from mum. Same lessons apply in every single message that we want to send. Right. We've still got some time left. Happy to hang around and go into some of this a little bit further. We've reached the end of what I wanted to deliver for you all tonight. And hopefully it's giving you some things to think about. It's giving you some ideas. There is a suggested forum post, right? So I just want to talk about that. The exercise in the forums. This isn't compulsory. This is an optional thing. It's something that hopefully some of you will think it's just about going back in your week or in the week to come. And when you spot a moment where some of this came into play, post about it, share it. Make it anonymous, of course. We don't want any names. But if it's interesting, if it helped make the point clearer for you, share it for everyone else. So that's a suggested thing, just relating to any of the concepts that we covered here today. There will be a quiz. You need to do the quiz, Guy. What do they need to do with the quiz to get their certificate at the end? Is there some dots they have to join?
Yeah, basically. So every webinar that you run will be associated with one module of the course, and you have to complete the quiz associated with each module in order to unlock the exam at the end of it and get your participation certificate and test your knowledge.
Right. So the quiz is only 5 questions a week.
Yep, and we'll talk a lot about the exam at the end of the course, but yeah, it's simple. You can try it as many times as you want. It's part of the learning process, so no stress. Okay, let's see what questions we've got. We've got heaps, and if it's all right with everyone, feel free to hang around for as long as you can, including you, Brenton. I'm quite happy to just keep going until they're all gone because there's some amazing questions in here. Thanks everyone for sending them in. I could talk about this all week. Great. No, it's been a lot of fun so far. Let's just start from the top. How do you overcome cultural and value differences that impact inference of the context? So if we start to say, okay, context matters, let's start with the big thing. Context matters. We've got to align it. Then underneath that, we have to look at where is it and why is it not aligned? So when you raise culture, then you're talking about one of the reasons for a misalignment in the context. And on the one hand, it doesn't matter what the reason is. What matters ultimately is we get the alignment. So what culture can do is it can give you some predictors. It can say, well, I have some predictions that say that culturally there's a context that's different, and I know it's often different. So I know I'm more likely needing to take that into account. So that's helpful. You can use it. If you say, well, is culture a reason for the communications to fail? Should I be worried about culture? Should it be an issue? Well, people have been communicating across cultures because of common ground. So if you need to realign a context that is culturally separated, start from the commonalities. Start from the things that you are more likely to be convinced this is the same. Use the constructivist educational idea, the theory, and say, right, start with what's clear and the same, build up from there, bit by bit. Because we all can think of a context that's different from our culture. We're all capable of handling exceptions. We might not handle them as well by default. But once we get used to them and familiar with them, they will become familiar. And the other thing that you can do, as I mentioned before about personal, your personal style, being true to yourself, when you interact with someone else, even if there's a cultural barrier, if you're still you each time, that will help them cross over, step aside from, bridge that cultural barrier to get a clearer communication, at least from you. Thank you. We've crossed over the hour mark. So Hannah, could you please start preventing questions from coming from now on? We'll just answer the ones we've got so far. We've got plenty. The next one is from Bhupesh, and that is, Is it possible to always be positive in professional communications? What happens if there's something not good that we need to communicate?
So I would, the simple answer to that question is no, because sometimes being inappropriately positive will create the wrong kind of emotional vector change in our audience. So trying to explain something that we know they're going to feel bad about, usually it will help if we show sensitivity to the impact it's going to have on them. And we've all been in that situation where we're down, we're upset, we're mad, we're something. And someone says to us, don't worry, it'll be all right. Well, that's hard to believe. Or look at the bright side. Now, many of us don't really appreciate that phrase in certain circumstances. Yeah, sometimes we do. Sometimes we need that. But there's not an absolute rule, in my view, that says you should always try to be positive. I think positivity should be maintained as a long-term goal. But sometimes the news, the discussion, the topic is bad enough and sad enough that there needs to be a transition back to that. And we don't need to have it in this conversation and in this message right now. So that's about what's our purpose. And should the purpose always be to fix it at the end of the message? No. But maybe at the end of 10, 20, 30 messages, maybe that's where we're aiming for, and maybe that's the journey of transition that we need to head for, not straight away.
I can think of one particular example going on right now with this COVID-19.
Yeah. You know, we're all seeing bad news. We're all having to block it, shelter ourselves from it. And, you know, for many, there's going to be more bad news before they get much good news. So we have to find coping mechanisms, and we need to be mindful that we don't disrupt people's coping mechanisms by trying to apply our own.
Interesting. How do we make communication effective in a corporate structure when things are ambiguous due to multiple stakeholders?
Corporate structure.
Or how do you, if the message has to go to many different groups of people at once?
Yeah, okay. So that's a huge trap. And this is where you get the most literal messages typically. Because if you start creating multiple versions of the same message for different audiences, immediately you're stereotyping. Immediately you're going to risk tremendous backlash because people will say, hang on, you said it this way to us, you said it that way to somebody else. Why are we different? They might not see that you're trying to be helpful to them. So that's really risky. I wouldn't normally recommend that. If you're going to do that, you need to make multiple authors. So one of the mistakes that a lot of really top-end managers do is that they try to control too much of the messaging, delegate the messaging, pass it down to someone who can deliver the message within a context and within a style that's going to suit their group, their portion more effectively. Now, still, there are some things that the CEO needs to say, but they're going to be brief or they're going to be clinical. And they're going to be well sanitized in most cases. So use the structure that you've got to break up the way the message needs to be handled. And that might be one way to deal with the ambiguity and the differences and the multiple stakeholders that are involved. I'm making some assumptions in that question, but hopefully that's still a useful answer.
I'm sure it will be. When someone's continually speaking about a particular topic and you want to have some input, how do you sort of interject? How do you sort of interrupt those people that are sort of those hyper excited?
I'm guessing the attendee here is looking for something a little more tricky than just interrupting. So let's talk about the psychology of why they're doing it. They're excited and they have more backlog of things to say than they're getting out. And every time they say something, they think of something else because they're in the creative mode. So you have to break the flow of creativity. That means you have to change what they're thinking about. If they keep thinking about the topic, they'll keep churning out stuff. So the trick is a distraction. Drop something. Deliberately drop something. Wave to someone. Sorry, I just needed to wave to them as they go past, right? Something that is contextually irrelevant in the moment, but requires them to pay momentary attention to it. They will have to realign their thought processes. They'll be like, what? Oh, there's your opening. So if you're looking for a trick, and I'm assuming you are, that's the trick. You want to break the creativity, and you break the creativity by giving their brain something that they don't know how important it is, so they better process it just momentarily. And that's when you get that moment where they think, oh, I was just going to say something and it's completely gone. Why does that happen? Because the neurons in the brain have gone left turn. And that's how powerful that momentary break of concentration can be. Doesn't always work, but it's a trick.
Yeah, keep us posted. Give it a try. Let us know in the forum. Mark asks, how important is it to build trust for effective communication?
Crucial. And second to that is, what if you don't have any yet? So that is fundamental to the point that I made earlier about being true. Being true to yourself, being true to your style, being true to your methods, being true to your character. It creates a shortcut for predictability in your audience. And so if you break that, and if you break that with an untruth, or if you break that with something that's perceived as an untruth, then at the very least, you will significantly increase the workload, the mental workload that audience has to do to truly accept their understanding of what we mean next time. And this is an important thing. It's not just, do they trust us? That's not the only issue. Do they believe us? Do they eventually believe us? That's not all there is to it. How much mental effort did they have to go through before they reached this conclusion that, yeah, I believe him this time? Every little bit of work that you made their brain do, for a start, they might not go all the way. They might stop halfway. They might give up. And it's work and mental effort that they could have spent working with the information, working with the knowledge. But instead, we've asked them to spend it on judging us. So the value of being honest in communications is that we avoid all of those risks, and we avoid all of the problems associated with the extra mental effort that someone has to do. Even if they trust us at the end of that thought process, we've still done damage.
Thank you. Anne's asked a question using some of the tricks you've been talking about today about block communication and audience motivation. Is it good to put in a quick quiz? Of course, it depends on who the audience is. And I'd say I'd add to that, maybe what was your plan? What was your aim with the poll today?
So my poll today, the reason for the poll today was two things. Firstly, it was contextual. Its job was to give the audience an understanding of what level of investigation were we going to do about this issue of communications. Where was I going to come from? Was I going to come from, this is how you write an email? Or was I going to come from, this is the higher theories of psychology? And it was meant to give you a starting point to say, okay, he's talking about a bit mental, a bit of the idea of how does it work, but it's also about learning what to do. So it was meant to give you that contextual starting point. It was also meant to be an affirmation, because I kind of expected that the majority of people would say skill. And that's an affirmation, because it says, and it's not surprising, because most of you are here because you believe it can be improved. So there's an element of skill in it, regardless of whatever else you might feel it is. So I was putting that in as a way, okay, if lots and lots of people think that we can all do better, that is an exciting, positive expectation frame of mind with which to start a discussion about what can I learn from Brenton? And so that was its purpose, and that was its role. And I wouldn't have put any poll unless I could think of a reason for what it's going to do in the minds of the audience. So everything must have a purpose. So if you can think of two reasons to have a quick quiz or a poll or a survey, don't do it if you only have one, unless it's a really important one, like a marketing survey, like where did you hear from us? But if you've got If it's for the audience, you need at least 2 reasons, and you need to know what they are, and you need to shape every question to align with that.
Okay. Muhammad asks, does the personality type also affect communication and the 3 cons?
It does, but not in a way that's going to affect the rules. So it will mean that some people will move more quickly through each of those phases. Or some people will conceptually pick up quicker. Some people will move more quickly to the emotional. And we know people that are, we call it short fuse, we call it all sorts of phrases, but these are people who move through the intellectual vector much more quickly. They're happy to reach conclusions, even assumptions, and they'll get to the feeling part super fast. You get others that go all the way down to, like, you've halfway through the conversation, they've stormed off to do something about it. So we know that it's mostly about the speed at which people move through the phases, and it'll be different on different days. The rules that say these people are more likely to do it this way based on personality are not important enough, because the rules that say, well, today I'm going to be like this and next week I'll be different because I'll be in a totally different frame of mind, that is often enough that their ability to predict is not necessarily helpful. We still got to be able to deal with whatever we're faced with. However fast they go through that phases, whether it's, this person today, that person tomorrow, we've still got to be ready for all eventualities. So yeah, you might get a bit more predictive benefit because you know a person's personality, but you're not going to necessarily apply it totally. So, I mean, you'll do it differently, but I don't see it as something that you can put into a framework.
Thank you. Kathleen sent in a couple of questions. I've selected one. Sorry, Kathleen, chuck the other. If any of the questions that we had to get rid of after 8:30, or any questions that have been double ups, and you really want to find out, chuck it in the forum. There's 2,500 of you listening. They're really excellent tools to use in this course to really flesh out what we discuss in the webinars. But the one I've gone with is, do you have any suggestions for clarifying tone in written communication without just outright saying, this is not an attacking email? I have sent and received emails that have come across a lot ruder than intended.
That's a tricky one. 2 parts to that, the question. Firstly, it's our own personal context that gets in the way. So when you write an email and it looks okay to you, it's because you're in an okay frame of mind to some extent. And you're not feeling vulnerable, you're not feeling sensitive, you're not feeling any of the things that will create raw, sensitive reactions because you're safe. So if you want to know whether or not someone might feel it differently, you want to try and imagine yourself unsafe. And one of the ways you can do that is something I call the deliberate disconnect. And this is applicable in any form of review. Okay, when you write something and then you review it immediately, you don't actually review it immediately. What you do is you recollect in your mind the thoughts you had when you authored it the first time. It's not really mentally possible to actually just read the words on the page. And that's why we get someone else to review it. And that's obviously a thing that we can do. Now, if you can just get someone else to review it, you would have your answer to your question already. But let's say you can't, come back to it 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later. Time of matter doesn't really, the delay itself isn't really important. If you mentally shift yourself into a new mood, change your mood. And if you're dealing with something that you think someone might be vulnerable, spend a few moments thinking about something that worries you. Shift your mind frame, then reread your email. Change your own mental state, and that will help you simulate in your mind what mental state another person might perceive that email in. It's all about putting yourself in their shoes. Because if you didn't predict it, it's purely because you missed their context, their starting point. So that's the objective. Get inside their head as much as you can. Trick yourself into it if you need to. Right? And if you can get someone else to review it and help you with it, all the better. But if you have to do it yourself, you've got to be someone else briefly.
Interesting. I think that answers Chris's question about the digital environment explaining a complex subject matter in a volatile situation when Chris feels his own anxiety growing or their own anxiety growing. Another sort of opportunity to sort of take a break.
Yeah, I think that momentum is a real thing in the emotional vector. We kind of know that. If we know that emotions build and they gather strength, and they gather strength because of the way they work biochemically. So, emotions are a burst of chemicals within certain areas of the brain and certain chemicals. And that's not like a tap. You don't just switch that off. And the more chemicals are created in that part of the brain, the more it triggers more of that, it's easy to compound. So disconnecting that process is an effective way of trying to prevent that from getting out of hand and getting to a storm. So, but the trick is to sense that might actually be happening.
Thank you. Roy is interested in the vectors of change, specifically when we want to use professional communications in an online business, sort of getting them motivated to actually click purchase, I assume. You've actually done a single webinar on that one. I think maybe we'll add that to the short course resources on digital social selling. Is that right?
Yeah, that's that subject MGI 534, right? That we launched last year.
Yeah, sort of rings a really strong bell.
It does. I mean, yes, there's lots of bits from that subject that talk about things like that. How do you digitally influence someone? And it comes down to the user experience. We will actually go through the user experience specifically on, is it next week we do that? I think it is. So we will definitely go into that, and we will talk about how the vectors of change are used in a practical example. But to give a quick example, if you're looking at an online purchase, there's decision points that a buyer or a person would go through. The first decision point is, do I know enough? Once they've decided they know enough, every single bit of information is contributing towards the emotional vector. So you got two problems. One is that you got to reduce negative emotions like frustration, things not working, can't find it, click doesn't happen, all the usual things that we just think are little annoying things. They're actually major obstacles to the emotional vector. They are greatly undermining the person, the emotion that they want, which is satisfaction. So get rid of all the barriers, get rid of all the things that don't work quite right, and focus on the happy emotion, which is, I know enough, I can relate to it. So the emotion is they have to relate to whatever it is that you want them to do. So it has to be expressed in a way that makes sense to them. And this is why when you're talking about online selling, headphones, for example, you see a person enjoying their day with headphones on. The assumption is if you have their headphones on, you'll enjoy your day. That's the subconscious connotation. Now, obviously that's overt, that's direct. But everything we do in online persuasion or online communications is some element of that. It's the same principle. Get rid of the emotional barriers, build the emotional satisfaction, end up with the motivational vector is click buy. Complicated. There's so much more to that. I think we'll need to pick up the rest of that next time. See if you've got any questions next week.
Yeah, cool. One of Ram's questions is, nowadays we have to use chat forums like Slack or Teams for messaging. Is it sometimes used as a short message tool or a big message to communicate? And is wondering how short messages, how you communicate without hurting the other person, how you provide, I guess, the context in a short message.
So we are going to go through that at length next week, but I'll give a quick answer to that. Is that the first and most important decision is what's appropriate for the medium. If you've got a topic that you think might hurt the other person, it's probably, you really have to question whether or not any of that should happen via instant messaging. So if you're dealing with something that's going to have a negative emotional vector, you're going to miss so many signals. You're going to miss so many opportunities to moderate yourself and to modify your approach that you just won't get them. And if there's risks of that nature, don't use instant messaging for that particular message, for that particular purpose. Remember, it's all about a purpose. And if the purpose is aligned with or has elements of might get negative emotional vectors, maybe don't use instant messaging. So that then obviates the whole question. Yeah, how do you say tough things over instant messaging? As a starting point, maybe we shouldn't. If you really have to, well, then that's a complicated question that we'll cover more of next week.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. A few quick ones. El Tayeb, does situation mean context?
Yes, that's a situation is an example of context, but it's a good example.
Cool. Thank you. Ashley asks, when we say logical understanding, do we mean their own personal logic, however faulty that is?
So before we can adjust, this is in the persuasion section. I mean theirs, because ultimately whether or not they give you their influence will be their decision. So it has to be their logic. It's their logic that we want to influence. If we want to influence their logic, if we want to change it so that they're aligned with us and aligned with our goals, because that's what persuasion is all about, then we have to know their logic. So before we can say anything, whether it be a question or a statement that might pull their logic in another direction, we have to know what it is. So we start with finding out where their logic currently lies and what underpins it, what contributes to their belief, their understanding, their whatever they're at. Then we start to evolve that. It's not about bringing along a big pile of my logic and handing it to you and saying, you know, check that out. That's not going to have anywhere near as much influence as if we go the other way around. So yes, it's their logic because that's what's going to make their decision.
Thank you. What and when is the correct use of CCing or @mentioning in emails or internal chats? Do you think the receiver seeing others included persuades or influences them more, or perhaps even if they're CC'd instead of made one of the primary recipients, does that affect things?
It definitely does have an impact, and we will go into more detail about that next week when we talk about email, but it definitely has an impact. And the simplest summary is it depends on the volume of emails that the recipient gets. My wife gets 10 times more emails than I get. If she gets CC'd on stuff, it's essentially a filing cabinet. That's something that she will do a word search on later if she needs to look something up, but unlikely to read it. Many people are in that boat. They're in that situation. I don't get anywhere near as, I mean, I will read the stuff that I'm CC'd on, or at least I'll read the first line or two, and I'll decide then whether or not I should read any further. So, but you normally would look at a CC field as being their filing cabinet, and the to field is their desk. That's the analogy. If you want something to land on their desk, put them in the to field. If you're happy for it to go straight into the filing cabinet, put it in the CC field. They can get it if they need it. It's not far away. That's the simplest analogy. So it really does make a difference, and we'll go into more detail about that next week.
Great. This is an interesting one. How can we persuade and influence someone who, not to say that the others weren't, but how can we persuade and influence someone who easily falls for fake news?
That's a very interesting, complicated, psychological, a whole bunch of things come into play there. And that is something we could probably go into a great deal of detail about. I will try to give a summarized answer. It will be incomplete, and I put that caveat out there up front. There is a ratio of importance for everyone between intellect and emotion. And belief is the ability, the desire, the need to hold something true without the need for justification. The desire to believe in something, the ability to believe in something, is part of our identity. What we believe in becomes us, becomes a piece of us. Our beliefs are a part of who we are. So we all need beliefs. We all need to believe in stuff. And when we use understanding that contributes to our sense of self, when our feelings about something, like fake news, and we have a reaction to that, and we want to own that reaction. Because remember I said before, we all own our feelings unequivocally. So when we react to something, if the reaction happens really quick, we own that reaction. Then the logic might come back later and say, hang on, no, you don't, that's the wrong thing that you own there. What we're essentially saying is that that piece of you is wrong. That piece of you is incorrect. It's broken. It's flawed in some way. So I'm kind of answering a different question here. I'm answering the question of why do people keep a belief in fake news, even in the absence of evidence and information. And it's a lot to do with how they identify with the feelings they had when they first adopted that piece of knowledge and piece of information. It's a really hard thing to change. And it's a really hard thing to influence because logic often isn't enough. That person has to be willing, strong enough, capable enough, or traumatized enough to disassociate that feeling from themselves, to disbelieve in that thing that they adopted as a truth. And how to stop them from jumping to that. The only effective way, two effective ways. One is a very long, drawn out educational process, but the other is the law of consequence. And that is that, and I have done this specifically with portions of my extended family. Been in a WhatsApp group, people sharing hoaxes, spam emails. Oh, check this out, right? And I'm the spam checker. So I'm the guy, I'm the one that takes it, looks it up, finds out it's a hoax or it's a thing that happened last year, and I immediately repost, no, this is a lie, this is a hoax. Here's the truth. It took me a year, but they've all stopped doing it in the family WhatsApp group, because every time they said something that they didn't check first, I checked it and I kind of felt a bit embarrassed. And that was the consequence trigger that makes them either not say it, or I said to them, you want me to check it first? Just send it to me. I'll verify it for you. You don't have to. But a lot of them are now verifying. And some of them are policing each other. And it's just within the family. So that's the law of consequence at work against the fake news. And that's peer pressure. And that's one of the, because then they won't want to identify with that embarrassment. So they'll be more cautious about what facts they take on next time. It's a very long, slow process, often doesn't work. Good luck.
I'm totally going to check all of my harebrained ideas with you, Brenton. You can verify my rubbish.
Don't send them all to me.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. It's actually quite interesting, and I think it relates to Chris's question. You've been very clear to differentiate personal from professional communication, the former consisting of expression while the latter has a purpose. Chris's experience is that it's often not an either or. At least in the terms of the totality of a conversation. Is there a middle ground? And also, what sort of communication would your WhatsApp example sort of be? Is that something that you, because you have an aim, no doubt, is that professional or is it personal?
Absolutely, there's a middle ground, and you know the cheating answer would be to say it's all middle ground. And the reason for me to make a strong point of the separation is because it's middle ground, but we have to still focus on the purpose. We have to put deliberate, constructive elements in the design of the message. So communications is all middle ground, but the message often isn't. So if you separate out this tool called a message, and it's got a job to do, and it's almost certainly going to be beholden to that job, but it might only be a piece of all of the communications that take place. There will still be the small talk. There will still be the empathy. There'll still be relating to people. There'll still be the sharing. There'll still be the expression. There'll still be all the things that make us human and social creatures. They don't go away, and I'm not suggesting that they ever should, but I'm saying that when we have a purpose and we have a message that needs to achieve its purpose, we bring different criteria into play in that moment, in that message, but we don't make that take away everything else. And so looking at it in a totality, absolutely, you know, there's tons of middle ground and we're all just human. And how much, you know, I express and I mean, I've shared things about my family because that's part of my being human. So if you go back to a real clinical point of view, why am I doing that? I'm doing it because me being more human makes what I say more acceptable to my audience, which is you. But on the other hand, I like telling about that stuff. So I do. And so there's always a bit of both.
You're so authentic. Can we consider social media as a concept for online business communications with our clients? And we've got 2 questions left, and we'll end with an interesting, difficult one.
Can we consider it as a concept? Yes. It's a very rich, broad, complicated concept. You can't even, it's so broad that you can't look at social media without looking at all of the parameters of human interaction and human communications. It's rich with all of them. We will go into a handful of them when we talk about this stuff in topic 3, I think. or no, 4. In 4, we're going to go through a few key things because we're going to talk about things like personal branding, online personal branding. And so in that thing, we're going to talk a bit more about the concepts behind that. But yes, I would consider social media as a concept because it does bring into play various rules. And we're still learning about what these rules are. And if you go looking for research, there's precious little research yet. And they're still coming up with things that they want to research. So we've got a lot of things to learn. And look at one of the biggest things that social media giants have learned, and some learned the hard way, is that humans don't want to have everybody as their friend with the same status. Remember when it all started, right? You only had 2 settings, friend or not friend. But we don't work that way as humans. We work with circles, and different circles are a different distance from us. So our close circle is different from our next circle and different from our next circle. And that's how we want to organize our relationships. And slowly, social networks are starting to allow us to do that in a similar way. So yeah, you might still have 4,000 friends on Facebook, but we can kind of structure them a little bit differently now, and we will be able to structure them more and more. And startups are coming out that are really focused on that need in the community, and everyone's just going to have to follow suit because that's natural human interaction. But they're absolutely concepts at work in there. We're still figuring them out.
Okay, final question, and thanks everyone for hanging around. Alan has said that you said earlier that unsuccessful communication was always the fault of the one trying to communicate something. Part of my aim in all of these short courses is not to inflame emotions and to sort of perhaps leave some of our biases at the door. So perhaps I'll rephrase this next bit of the question. Is Donald Trump a professional communicator?
As an example, he's a very prominent example of communication, some kind of communications. It's not so much about the labels, but his communications go a long way. They reach. And so that makes him an interesting study to look at. And one of the things that is effective about his messaging is that he's very effective at tapping into emotional vectors, but he's finding that recently that the audience that he can influence with those emotional vectors is a little narrower than what it was in the past. And part of that is because of the concept we talked about before, the identity element versus the logical element is a ratio. For each person, there's a ratio of how much we are responding to the emotional impact and how much we're responding to the logical impact. And that sort of ebbs and flows even for individuals. And so when a person is having less impact with their communications, that's often because they're shifting that ratio in their audience. So sometimes you find that people that have a particular strategy and rely on a particular mechanism in communications to achieve their results, if they don't have a lot of other ways of using different tools to communicate, if they're not as familiar with the concepts, if they're choosing their communications tools based on instinct, then they might be at a disadvantage when the landscape of their audience changes, and that it's a little harder for them to adapt their tools and their methods and the applications of those methods and how they use them. So on the same sense, like if you make a direct comparison as communication tools, we know that Donald Trump is very good at evoking reactions and implementing that as a communications tool and using that. But then as a purely tool basis, his predecessor, Barack Obama, was very good at using the pause in his communications as a tool. And who is a better communicator is something that everyone gets to judge for themselves. But they're using tools differently. And you'll find that Obama is an example who used a wider array of tools and therefore had more options available in different circumstances. Whereas I feel that Donald Trump has tools that he's continuing to use and not having the same effect that they used to. And because it's instinct, it's hard. I think it's difficult for people that communicate instinctively to take advice that's logically driven.
Okay. Well, it's 9:06 local time. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of those amazing questions. Yeah, fantastic. If you had any more questions, I had to get rid of a few, and I'm sorry for that. Just so that we didn't
Put
make
them on the
Brenton
forums.
talk all week. Yeah, chuck them in the forums. Um, I guess all that's left for now is to thank Hannah for hanging around. Thanks all of you for hanging around as well. There's still a solid 250 of you. And Brenton, thanks so much for a webinar and the next few webinars. I'm very excited. I'll leave you to signpost for next week
My pleasure.
and sign off. Thanks so much.
That's all for us for now. Thank you and good night.